Flight 782 to Los Angeles is now boarding. Gate 14. Bernice West adjusted her curly wig in the airport restroom mirror, tilting her head like she was inspecting a cake that didn't quite rise. No makeup, thrift store earrings, a pastel scarf tied like she was heading to church instead of 35,000 feet up in the air. She looked harmless, sweet even. Exactly how she planned it. But underneath that soft smile and grandmotherly air was the mother of Julian West, billionaire CEO of Ascend Air, the youngest black executive to ever own a commercial airline fleet. And today, Mama West was going undercover. No assistants. No press. Just her, a seat in economy, and a growing list of anonymous complaints that her son's airline was slipping, fast. She'd asked Julian to let her handle it quietly. Give me one flight. If I'm wrong, I'll bake the crew cookies. But if I'm right. Julian had only raised an eyebrow. Now, boarding pass in hand, Bernice stepped onto Flight 782, unknowingly walking into a storm of incompetence, neglect, and disrespect that would end with every crew member out of a job before the wheels touched the ground. Bernice didn't need to fake the little groan she let out as she lifted her carry-on into the overhead bin. She could feel the eyes of the flight attendant standing nearby, a tall woman in a tight bun and tighter smile, whose name tag read Amber. Amber didn't move an inch to help. Bernice turned to her with a warm grin. Would you mind lending a hand, sugar? My shoulder's not what it used to be. Amber glanced at her, then at the half-empty bin. You're not supposed to lift anything you can't carry yourself, ma'am. Policy. Then walked away. Bernice blinked. Well, all right then. She took her aisle seat, 22C, and pulled out a worn leather notebook from her purse. Flipped it open. Jotted down a name. Amber, fails empathy test. One line in, and the flight hadn't even left the ground. 10 minutes later, a man in a business suit was arguing with a flight attendant about his vegan meal. Apparently, it had been replaced by a ham sandwich. In the row ahead, a young mother was trying to calm her toddler while asking for water. The attendant snapped, "We'll get to you when we get to you." Bernice's pen scratched the paper. Another name. She looked around. The crew moved like they were doing passengers a favor just by existing. Cold smiles, half-hearted instructions, an atmosphere that said we don't care and you can't make us. Her eyes narrowed. She'd worked planes for 30 years before Julian made his first million. She knew the signs, and this flight was bleeding rot from the inside. When the captain finally came on the speaker, his voice was rushed and garbled. Folks, yeah, we're gonna get out of here soon, just waiting on a thing. Hang tight. A thing? Bernice's lips tightened. Something told her this wasn't just bad service. This was the kind of rot that starts at the top of a crew, and spreads. She clicked her pen. Wrote one more word. Fire. 20 minutes into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed, but the vibe didn't. It was all wrong, tense, indifferent, transactional. Bernice could feel it in the air like stale coffee and cheap perfume. She pressed the call button. Amber returned, face already annoyed. Yes. Bernice kept her voice syrupy sweet. Just wondering, dear, could I have a ginger ale? My stomach's a little unsettled. Amber sighed loud enough for row 23 to hear. We're not doing full drink service yet. We'll come through the cabin soon. Then she turned and walked off before Bernice could say another word. Bernice didn't reach for her pen. Not yet. She just stared ahead, expression blank. Then she looked across the aisle, a middle-aged man, fidgeting uncomfortably, his elbow jammed against the wall. His leg was shaking. She leaned in slightly. You all right, sir? He gave a half-smile, but his face was pale. Claustrophobic. Happens every time. Usually I ask the attendant if I can just stand for a few minutes after takeoff. Before Bernice could answer, another attendant, younger, gum-chewing, name tag turned backward, appeared and barked. "Sir, you need to sit down now. The seatbelt sign is on. Don't make this a thing." The man opened his mouth to explain, but she was already gone. Bernice jotted another line in her notebook. This was no fluke. This was systemic, cultural. They weren't overworked. They were untouchable. And worst of all, no one seemed surprised. The passengers didn't complain. They just tolerated it. Because people had learned that on some flights, being ignored is better than being noticed. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed from the galley, followed by muffled swearing. A moment later, the intercom crackled. Ladies and gents, sorry, looks like we're having a minor issue with the hot food prep. We'll be offering snack bags instead." Half the cabin groaned. Bernice didn't. She was too busy watching one of the attendants try to discreetly wipe something off the microwave unit. Smoke. Oil. She leaned back slowly. If this crew thought they were just having another lazy day in the skies, they had no idea who was sitting in 22C. And by the time this plane touched down, they were going to find out. Bernice waited until snack bags were being passed around, crinkly little packages with 2 pretzels, a breath of trail mix, and a whisper of customer care. She accepted hers with a polite nod, made a show of rummaging through her purse, and pulled out her phone. Airplane mode, but Wi-Fi? Still fair game. She opened the Ascend Air app, scrolled all the way down to the bottom, and clicked the quiet little feedback button. Not the regular survey, the hidden one. The one reserved for executive review only. Julian had once joked it was the bat signal. Bernice started typing, thumbs moving slow but certain. Flight 782. Cabin crew discourteous, dismissive, and actively hostile to requests. In-flight equipment appears faulty. Passenger safety and comfort disregarded. Initiating direct observation protocol. Recommend temporary suspension of this flight crew pending investigation. She hesitated, then added. BW. She hit send. Across the country, in a high-rise in Atlanta, one of Julian's analysts would see it within 30 seconds. The initials were a code, Bernice West. Internal action would begin immediately. Quiet. Swift. No alarms. Back in seat 22C, Bernice sipped warm ginger ale someone had finally brought, unrequested. Not Amber. A new girl. Nervous eyes. Clearly still learning. Bernice made a note, one to watch, might still be salvageable. Just then, someone shouted. I've been pressing the call button for 15 minutes. It came from row 28. An elderly man, clearly uncomfortable, holding his arm awkwardly, stiff, maybe in pain. The nearest flight attendant glanced at him, then kept walking. Bernice stood. Slowly. Calmly. She walked past Amber and the gum chewer, past the drink cart, and knelt beside the man. Where does it hurt, sweetheart? He blinked at her. Shoulder. Old injury. Gets locked sometimes on long flights. She gently adjusted his seat angle, slipped a small pillow under his elbow, and motioned toward his water bottle. There we go. A young man across the aisle leaned forward. Are you a nurse? Bernice just smiled. No, baby. I'm something else. As she made her way back to her seat, Amber caught her eye, suspicious. Ma'am, please don't wander the cabin during beverage service. Bernice didn't even slow down. She looked her square in the eye and said, in a voice like velvet-covered steel. You'll want to be careful how you speak to me. The flight's only halfway done. Amber blinked, confused, unsettled, but said nothing. Bernice sat back down and picked up her notebook. A line was already forming at the edge of her page. This time, she didn't write a name. She wrote a number. 1.5 hours left. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft ding, and the intercom crackled to life again. "Folks, we're now at cruising altitude, feel free to move about the cabin." As if on cue, a toddler 2 rows up began to cry, high-pitched and panicked. The young mother from earlier, clearly exhausted, bounced him on her lap and softly whispered, "It's okay, baby, almost there." Amber passed right by. No glance. No pause. Just cold indifference. Bernice turned her head slowly. She wasn't the only one noticing now. Across the aisle, the claustrophobic man from earlier was now breathing into his hand, trying to stay calm. The nervous new attendant was serving water down the row, apologizing for the delay with every cup. And then, it happened. A loud thud came from the galley. Then a curse. Then silence. Passengers turned their heads. Bernice looked back just in time to see Amber and the gum chewer disappear behind the curtain, whispering urgently. 2 minutes passed. Then 5. No one came out. Bernice unbuckled her belt, stood, and walked to the curtain. Just far enough to overhear. "Don't care if it's broken, we're not getting written up again. Shouldn't have even been flying today. I told dispatch my hours were maxed. And that old lady in 22C keeps watching like she owns the damn plane." Bernice smiled. She pushed the curtain aside, just slightly. The 2 attendants froze. "Problem in the galley?" she asked, voice light, but pointed. Amber stiffened. "Ma'am, passengers aren't allowed back here." "Oh, I'm not just a passenger." Bernice tilted her head. "I'm the reason none of you are getting your vacation requests approved next quarter." Silence. Bernice gave them one last look, then turned and walked back to her seat. She picked up her phone again. This time, she didn't type. She called. Julian answered on the second ring. "Mama," he said, surprised. "Activate the protocol," she said calmly. "This crew is done." Julian didn't ask any questions. She hung up, then looked around the cabin, eyes meeting hers, eyebrows raised. Somehow, without a single announcement, passengers sensed the shift. Something was happening. Power was shifting. And the Queen was awake. 15 minutes after the call, a small notification pinged on Amber's crew tablet. She glanced at it, then froze. Her brows furrowed. She read it again. Then again. Finally, she turned to the gum chewer, real name Kendra, according to the badge she'd finally flipped around. Whispered something tight and panicked. Bernice watched it all unfold like a matriarch at a family dinner where someone just confessed to stealing the inheritance. Kendra's face drained of color. "You're kidding." Amber shook her head. They both turned, almost in sync, toward Bernice in seat 22C. She smiled at them like she had baked a pie just for this moment. Amber walked down the aisle slowly, like a student sent to the principal's office, only to realize the principal was sitting in the classroom the whole time. "Ma'am," she said, her voice suddenly dipped in artificial sugar, "I understand there's been some concerns." Bernice closed her notebook. "You understand that now?" Amber tried to smile. It came out crooked. "Of course. We, strive for excellence." "No, you don't." Amber blinked. "You strive for convenience. For shortcuts. For silence from passengers. I've seen it on flights like this before. I just didn't expect it to be happening on my son's airline." That line landed like a slap. Whispers rippled through the rows behind her. Amber's mouth opened. Closed. "Wait, your son." Bernice stood slowly, commanding the aisle with the kind of quiet authority that makes everyone shut up without knowing why. "My name is Bernice West. Founder of West Regional Air, former flight operations chief, and mother to Julian West, CEO of Ascend Air. This flight," she said, voice rising just slightly, was a test. And every one of you in uniform has failed it. Silence. Then the quiet snap of someone recording. The nervous young attendant, Eva, peeked out from the galley, her face pale. She looked at Bernice, terrified she'd be lumped in with the rest. Bernice locked eyes with her. "Not you," she said gently. "You've still got a chance." Amber looked like she'd been slapped. You can't just fire us mid-flight." Bernice arched an eyebrow. "I already did. You just haven't landed yet." The cabin was a pressure cooker. Passengers whispered behind raised phones. A few were openly filming. Others stared, wide-eyed, finally understanding that the woman in 22C wasn't just some feisty grandma, she was the boss. Amber retreated to the galley like a soldier ducking gunfire. Kendra followed, fuming. Inside, the whispers turned into hissing panic. "This is insane. She can't just. She can. She just did. What if they scrub our certifications? You know what that means, right? You think I care? I'm quitting after this flight anyway." "Yeah, well, you better hope the FAA doesn't hear about the overtime lie. That's jail time." Outside the galley, Bernice sat calmly, flipping her notebook closed and placing it in her lap like a sealed verdict. She glanced out the window, then up at the intercom. Still no word from the captain. Interesting. She stood again. This time she walked straight to the cockpit, calm, collected. She knocked once, sharply. A voice answered, "Please don't disturb the..." "This is Bernice West," she said. "Open the door." There was a pause. Then a click. Inside sat the pilot, early 50s, tired eyes, uniform slightly unkempt. The co-pilot looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat. "Ma'am," the captain began, "I wasn't aware you were on board." "No," Bernice said, "and that's part of the problem." She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. 15 minutes later, the intercom came on. The captain's voice was clearer now, more composed, maybe even a little afraid. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be beginning our descent into Los Angeles shortly. On behalf of the crew, we'd like to apologize for any issues during today's flight. We're taking internal reports seriously." Click. Bernice returned to her seat, nodding politely to a young man in first class who mouthed "legend" as she passed. Back in 22C, Eva knelt beside her. "Ms. West. I just want you to know, I tried. I really did." Bernice smiled warmly, touched her hand. "I saw. And I'll be making sure someone else sees, too." Eva looked like she might cry. From the galley, Amber peeked out, eyes red, mascara smudged. But it was too late. The show was over. The audience had chosen their side. And Bernice? She just sat back as the plane began to descend, calm, quiet, and ready for the landing that would change several lives forever. Bernice walked through the jet bridge first, greeted not by fanfare, but by silence and sharp suits. Julian stood among them. No cameras. No press. Just presence. Tall, sharp, and deadly calm, the kind of energy that said, "I don't yell. I just end things." He walked up to his mother, kissed her cheek. "Mama." "Baby," she replied, adjusting her coat like it was armor. "They're inside. You'll want to start with Amber." Julian nodded once. Didn't ask questions. He never did when Bernice gave him that look. Behind her, Amber stepped off the plane, and froze. Her eyes locked on Julian, and the clipboard in the hands of a man beside him. No one told me he'd be here," she whispered. Bernice turned around, one hand resting lightly on her purse. "Ma'am," Amber stammered, "I didn't know who you were. I swear, if I had." "That's the problem," Bernice interrupted. Respect isn't reserved for names you recognize. It's given because it's the right damn thing to do. Kendra tried to walk past without stopping. Not so fast, said Julian, not even looking at her. Kendra Thompson, you're officially suspended pending review of misconduct, falsified records, and failure to assist passengers. Amber's face twisted. You can't do this, she snapped. I've been flying longer than half these people have been alive. Julian tilted his head. And yet, somehow, the only one with basic human decency on that plane was the newest hire. He looked at Eva, who stood awkwardly at the side. You, he said. Come with me. We're going to have a conversation about advancement. Eva blinked. Me? Bernice smiled softly. Told you someone would see. Amber stepped forward, still desperate. This isn't fair. Bernice didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You treated that cabin like it was yours to survive, not serve. But the sky doesn't belong to you, baby. It belongs to the people trusting you to keep them safe. Today, you broke that trust. She turned to walk away, stopping just long enough to look over her shoulder. Flight 782 is grounded. You are, too. Amber didn't answer. She couldn't. Outside, Bernice and Julian walked toward a black car waiting by the curb. You sure you don't want to handle more of these personally? He asked, smirking. She shook her head. Next time, I want my first-class seat and a glass of red. But I had to remind you, the people under you are the ones flying your name through the sky. Never forget that. Julian nodded. I won't. As the doors closed and the city lights washed over them, Bernice leaned back, took out her notebook, and wrote the last word on the final page. Accountability.